I'm going to turn to Ira now and bring you in on this conversation. We talked on the phone, and I said, you know, you have an interesting job, and it's not only, it's more than that, it's complex. Anti-Semitism is such a complex term, and we could have a whole day just on defining what that means. But let me just get you to maybe start with the statement by the president of Germany's Council of Jews last year, where he described the rise of anti-Semitism in his country as, quote, the worst times since the Nazi era. So in your view, what's behind the growth of anti-Semitism across Europe, as you define it and understand it in recent years? And what can the Department of State do to combat it? I know that's a broad question, but I want to get your role in here for people to understand.
Well, Charles, it is broad. When you say what's behind, I'm not sure I have a full answer for you. But in traveling to 18 countries in Europe over the last almost 2 years, the complexity is really shocking. One of the things I always look at is the Soviet Jewry movement as an historical precedent of the success of a human rights religious issue. And yet, as difficult as that was, and certainly in the 60s and 70s, it was far from sure that that would have any success, there was one address that you really had to fix the problem, and that address was the Kremlin. What we have here is literally dozens of countries, and in any given one country, I can't tell you there's one address to use to fix it. So then every country I've seen in Europe, and I think I'm going to be doing some more travel outside of Europe in the next few months, you find multiple forms of anti-Semitism. Just some of them, you have your classical xenophobic, right-wing nationalist anti-Semitism. You have left-wing anti-Semitism that often is connected to, sometimes to green movements or anti-global movements, anti-colonial movements. You have anti-Semitism that's associated with the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. You have some populist anti-Semitism and soccer hooliganism. In almost every country, you have all four. Now, but in certain countries, some predominate and others do not. So I like to look at, for example, the FRA survey, the Fundamental Rights Agency survey that was released a year ago, but really taken 2 years ago. And it asked the question, among others, among Jewish communities in 8 EU countries. Have you thought about immigrating over the last 5 years because of anti-Semitism? The answer EU-wide was 26%, 29%. In Hungary, it was 48%. This is 2 years ago. In France, 46%. Now, if you knew nothing better, you'd say, oh, France and Hungary are very similar, and nothing could be further from the truth. France has all the anti-Semitism that I spoke about and probably more, and yet violence perpetrated by people who self-proclaimed as Muslims, a very small percentage of the Muslim community, is what worries Jews most now, today. And that's not to say the other forms of anti-Semitism aren't a real problem. Hungary, you don't have any type of anti-Semitism like that. You really have right-wing xenophobic. You have a Jobbik party that harkens back to the 30s in the sense it has parliamentary representation, significant, and street militia, as well as deeply anti-Semitic philosophy. So it is an incredibly complex and not easily solvable. And I'm not sure I got to the question of...
No, well, yeah, you did, but it's a huge question, but I know, but the rise of it. And I mean, I think just most of us would look at the news and what we've read. In the last 5 years, it's been pretty dramatic, hasn't it? And how do you account for that, and the various forms of anti-Semitism? How do you account for this dramatic rise?
Well, that in itself sometimes is of some discussion, and it does differ from country to country. I would have people who tell you in the Ukraine it's probably less than 5 years. But by and large, most people I think that I speak with will tell you, yes, there was a rise. But frankly, this is at least a 15-year phenomenon. It's a 21st century phenomenon of the rise. And I'm not sure I know that I can account for it. I have a single reason. We know it's there, and it's what's at stake here. First off, I think you mentioned the 30s. And there are certainly, you talk about Jobbik or Golden Dawn in Greece, there are analogies to the 30s, but I also think we can't predict what's 10 or 20 years out. But in the short term, 5 years or so, we're not looking at the 1930s. We're not 1939. What we are possibly facing, if these trends that you speak about continue, I could see smaller Jewish communities in Europe disappearing. Communities that may have been around 500 years, in the case of places like Greece or Turkey, 2,300 years. And that could happen. The French Jewish community is not going to disappear in that time frame like that. 500,000 Jews are not leaving France, but it could be diminished.
Madam Secretary, I know this is an issue close to your heart. Do you want to say something about what you're seeing on the world stage now? Because I know you're engaged in these issues in many different roles that you play now.
Well, I think there are always a number of reasons for prejudice of any kind, but partially I think what is happening is there is kind of the facelessness of globalization, and so there is a resurgence of identity with your particular group, and which then brings on nationalism, and virulent nationalism, when you're talking about Hungary, for instance, always needs an enemy. And so what happens, has been happening, is it doesn't matter what the smaller group is or not, the homogeneous group gets the blame for whatever the problems are. And then if you marry that with economic problems and a sense of inequality and disparity, you always have to find somebody to blame. And unfortunately, that the Jewish communities have always somehow been blamed for other people's poverty, which is one, I mean, there's so many stereotypical things that are appalling, and that's part of this combination of nationalism and economic inequality, I think, is part of the problem.
Charles, if I could just follow, Madam Secretary, I think that does hit a nerve. When I was in Greece last year, I had a minister tell me what would happen, what European country could keep its democracy when it has 62% youth unemployment, when it has 25% drop in GDP, it has 26% unemployment. We've kept our democracy, but also in Greece, which has a tiny community left, only 5,000. You can find the Protocols of the Elders of Zion in almost any bookstore you go into. I personally went there, into bookstores in downtown, kind of Barnes & Noble type of bookstores, and you find copies of the Protocols. There's 29 different versions of the Protocols being circulated in Greece today.
Wow.